Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. Whenever you think your job is hard, do remember that back in 2002, Raymond Benson was assigned the task of turning this moment into prose. Yes, we are going to be talking about the Dine of the Day novelization. Surprisingly, also the very final James Bond movie novelization to exist thus far. From License to Kill to Dine of the Day, we had a pretty steady stream of things, and, well, following on from this, I guess the next two films went back to Fleming for their direct inspiration, and then by the time Skyfall rolls around, the marketing benefits of having a novelization on shelves at the same time a movie was released, I guess, was not deemed especially lucrative, so here we are, final James Bond novelization to date. It's also the final full-length novel to be released during Raymond Benson's tenure as the official 007 scribe. It was released the same year as The Man with the Red Tattoo in 2002, and of course to tie into the release of the film and celebrate 40 years of cinematic Bond, Benson peppers a good few more references to the films than what's even in the movie with this book, which felt very appropriate given the anniversary year, and I'm going to be touching on some of my favourites as we go. And as with all of the previous novelizations that I've covered on the channel, one of the things that I'm most interested in seeing is what, if anything, does the novelization add to the story as we see it in the film in terms of significant sequences, plot details, extra bits of characterization, and so on. I already know, or at least I assume I do at least, the broad strokes of the story going in, so can there still be some surprises, and can I come away with a newfound appreciation of characters or moments in the film with some added perspective provided by the novelization, and, of course, perhaps most importantly, can the novelization just be a fun book to read in its own right? I've gotten both of those things with the previous Raymond Benson novelizations. Tomorrow Never Dies added a lot of extra bits with Waylon and had a different angle on the climax fight, which I really enjoyed, and with The World's Not Enough he filled in a lot of the backstory details for Renard and Electra. It's things like that that I feel make for rewarding elements for Bond fans to go back and revisit these novelizations, and does Dine of the Day fit that same bill? Let's get into it. The story begins just as in the film, with Bond and a couple of colleagues surfing into North Korea to infiltrate a Colonel Moon's base. We get names for Bond's otherwise nameless colleagues from the film, and some extra detail about North Korea itself, and this is obviously where a novelization can really flourish, by giving additional context for things that you just can't in a film without it feeling like a big information dump. Things proceed as you see in the film. Bond is betrayed, Zhao gets diamonds in his face, hovercraft chase, and so on. One of Bond's colleagues gets a significantly gorier death, though, than what we see in the film, which I thought was pretty gnarly. Moon still blows up the helicopter containing both the guys, but one of them actually staggers out, and Bond sees him burning. It's a really horrific moment. As ever with Raymond Benson's writing, I just love the action. It's nice and exhilarating, really thrilling stuff. But it's once Bond is captured and we have him incarcerated that I think we get some cool added detail that I think give you a greater appreciation of the torture that Bond is going through and that he's having to endure and the length of time that he's there. It's also here that we get something of a summary of James Bond's backstory, which I wasn't really expecting. I mean, it's a very top-level sort of thing, you know, it's about his parents died, he had to go live with an aunt, and the old M is mentioned, old villains and Bond girls are mentioned, and Bond is essentially, the point of this is that Bond is essentially retreating into his own memories as a way of coping with the horrific torture that he's undergoing. I really liked, there is a bit as well where the phrase, "we have all the time in the world," is evoked in quite a morbid way. Time passed. He wasn't sure how long. Weeks turned into months, but life within the North Korean military prison seemed to be one continuous day, or night, depending on how one looked at it. We have all the time in the world. Well, those words certainly applied now. Bond knew he was thinner and that his beard had grown. He felt weakened and very much alone. The cold, dingy cell where he slept was his only refuge from the suffering that existed outside the steel door. All the referencing and such makes sense, given that this is being released in 2002. Dine of the Day is the big 40th anniversary celebration of the film series, though I do suspect that the names of some of the characters, the villains and the girls that are mentioned, are done in a way to straddle both film and book continuity if you really want to, you know, try to fit this in somewhere. And I mean that in terms of, you know, we have Hugo Drax mentioned, Goldfinger, and so on, and not just, you know, characters that solely existed in either the films or the books. Now, I've said this before, but I do think that it is probably quite a thankless task for any author to have to, you know, fit a novelization into wherever the literary timeline of events is. I think John Gardner clearly learned this the hard way with his novelization of License to Kill, because obviously in the film, License to Kill, Felix has his leg bitten off by a shark, which is what happens to him in the book. live and let die. So in order to make that continuity make sense, John Gardner calls out the fact that this is the second time that Felix has had a limb bitten off by a shark. But personally, I am just considering this a novelization of the events that we see in the movie. I am not taking this as what happened to James Bond after the events of The Man with the Red Tattoo. I think the approach is deliberately vague, which is really how it should be. Just don't think about it too much is probably the best way to come to it. Like, when Bond is referring back to Hugo Drax, is he referring to the madman with the missile from Fleming, or is he referring to the other madman who built a base in outer space from the film? Point is that it doesn't really matter. Anyway, just in these opening bits, I did think there was another really powerful moment, actually. This is when Bond is kind of accepting his fate. He's gearing himself up for death. They rode for an hour. He was alone with the general and the guard in the back of the truck. Old habits die hard. So Bond weighed his options, but was forced to conclude that they had run out. He did not know why the general wanted to go to this effort before executing him, and realized that he no longer cared. He allowed himself a brief, sad smile of self-congratulation. He had not been broken. Death would be his reward and his release. The prisoner trade-off happens. Bond is then held captive by MI6, and as they're doing his medical report, there's a little reference back to his shoulder injury from The World's Not Enough, which I thought was really nice. And then we have the scene with M, and I'm going to talk more broadly about the characterization of M in the novelization versus in the film, because the novelization fixes one of the bigger issues I have with the film, actually. So in the film, M is, of course, stone cold towards Bond in these early scenes, like, to an absolutely brutal extent.
You're no use to anyone now.
And I always felt this a little jarring coming off of the back of The World's Not Enough, a story where M's personal life became a part of the plot in a really big way. I felt we saw a more human side to the character in that story. It felt like she and Bond really went through something as a pair. So, in Die Another Day, the film, for her to be so damn cold towards this guy who really did save her ass in that previous mission, it always just feels a little bit too unwarranted to me. The counterpoint to all of this is, of course, that, well, she's doing her job. She's trying to remain objective, but in the movie I do feel like there isn't even like a flicker of humanity behind that facade, and in the book there is, and these are seemingly small, but I think very significant things. It's things like she refers to him as James, she refers to him with his first name, and she has moments of consideration, you know, she's weighing up what he's saying, and there's this line which I think sums up her motivations quite nicely. M stopped and turned. She eyed him evenly and said, "This isn't about me, Bond. Lives are at risk, and I will do anything to protect the integrity of the service." She paused, took a breath, and said, "You're no use to anyone now." There's also an additional bit, like an additional scene, we don't have this in the film. This is where Robinson, M is back in London, and Robinson comes in to tell her that Bond has escaped. "Robinson, stay on it. I'd like to be kept informed. In the meantime, alert all of our station heads that we're looking for him." "Yes, ma'am." M went into the inner office and shut the door. She sighed heavily as she saw the pile of letters and reports that required her attention. She did, however, allow herself a smile at Robinson's news, which again is a small thing, but I do think that it says a lot, and I feel like there's a bit more nuance to her approach to Bond, like in the book, than in the film. In the film, it's kind of like someone pissed in her cornflakes and she just wants everybody to know about it. And so, ironically enough, the novelization version of the character ends up feeling more in keeping with where the cinematic character was at that time, coming off of the back of The World Is Not Enough, than the cinematic character does in Die Another Day. Anyway, Bond escapes in the same manner as he does in the film, by lowering his heart rate. This ability, though, Bond's ability to do this, is set up in an earlier chapter in the novelization, which I appreciated. It's mentioned when Bond is being held captive in North Korea, and I thought it was a nice detail to just brace the audience for the incredulity of it. We have one of the more significant additions to the story here as Bond escapes the facility, and we see that he's actually in Seoul, in South Korea, not in Hong Kong like in the film, and we have a whole chapter focusing on this little interlude where he's having to acquire money, he's having to figure out what to do, how to get to Hong Kong and such, while staying undercover and off-grid. It's not a huge bit, but it's a really nice addition, and I think it's really good at highlighting the difficulty that Bond, or indeed anyone, would have in such a situation where he has no resources. He's basically having to, you know, survive on his own wit and skill, and I really enjoyed that whole bit. I thought it was really great stuff. It's also in this bit that Bond has a rather prophetic cryptic nightmare, a dream about Colonel Moon, which provides some really nice foreshadowing for later in the story. I always like it in the books whenever Bond has some kind of a dream or a vision or hallucination or something, so I was happy to see one of those in here. It's also around here that we get one of my favourite references of the whole book. The Tomorrow newspaper gets a mention. It's still in circulation somehow. Bond sees someone reading it. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during the PR meetings that they would have to have had about relaunching that paper after their previous CEO tried to inaugurate World War III. I wonder if they ever got those elusive broadcasting rights in China after all. And just while I'm on the subject of references, there are some additional ones around this part of the book that I did want to call out, one of which completely blew my mind. So seriously, all the props in the world to Raymond Benson for getting a California Girls mention in here. The song that of course plays when Bond is having his snowboarding action sequence in A View to a Kill, and it's on the radio as Bond arrives in Cuba and checks in this book. I thought that was amazing. I just loved that. San Monique, the island from Live and Let Die, is mentioned as well, and Dr. Alvarez at the Gene Clinic, he has a Fabergé egg amongst his office bric-a-brac, which I also really liked. So a lot of the plot details here play out just like in the film. Bond goes to the hotel, gets cleaned up, the Phyllis shave gets a mention, which I thought was funny, because between the film, the novelization, and the Nightfire video game, they really got their money's worth of their product tie-in. Bond meets with Jinx and they have sex, he infiltrates the gene therapy clinic, action kicks off with Zhao. We do get some interesting backstory stuff on him in all of this as well, I should say. Bond ends up traveling back to London, just like in the film, though in the novelization, he arrives on the plane's landing gear. He's literally holding on to the thing and then hops off. And so this bit was deleted from the final film, but it was at least filmed. Snippets and behind-the-scenes imagery of it has been released over the years, though the scene itself never has been in its entirety, so it's interesting to read and imagine how this scene might have played out. We meet Gustav Graves and Miranda Frost here. There's the whole sword fight that occurs at the Blades Club, and then Bond is taken back into the fold at MI6, and then we have a slightly different take on the simulator sequence from the film here. There's just a few details that are different, like Bond doesn't see Moneypenny dead like he does in the film, and the way that he takes out M's would-be kidnapper is slightly different as well. Rather than shooting through the guy's hand and hitting M in the shoulder, he shoots through M's shoulder to hit the guy behind her, which I thought was really cool and nuts. Anyway, the Q scene plays out much like in the film. It's interesting, though. I don't feel like Benson really comes down too firmly on this being a new Q like the film does. Q still has his line here about, as I learned from my predecessor Bond, I never joke about my work, so the predecessor is still referenced, but I feel like the novelization is missing that slight, I mean, it's a blink and you miss it arc from the film, by which Bond initially refers to Q as quartermaster and seems quite reluctant to embrace him, and then at the end of the scene, only when he's been impressed with all of the gadgets, does he reward him with the title of Q. Here's one of the film's writers talking about that bit.
It was an opportunity to sort of play a scene between Bond and the new Q that explained to people in a subtle way what Q stands for, which is quartermasters.
Give me the old firing range any day, quartermaster.
And so hopefully that scene sort of marks the passing of Desmond, shows Bond not wanting to call him Q at the beginning, and then awarding him the kind of endearment of Q.
Just took a few seconds, Q.
Maybe it was seen as just being too much of a superfluous detail. It wasn't really deemed necessary to include it here. Maybe it would have drawn too much of a focus. It would have been planting too firm a flag in where this is taking place in terms of continuity, in terms of book and film. But I mean, otherwise Bond gets, he gets the same gadgets, he gets the ring and the invisible car, and there are plenty of references in the chapter to the other gadgets that are dotted around the place as well. One additional reference around this point that I wanted to mention, when Bond is in his office at the start of the simulation bit, he has Scaramanga's golden bullet as part of his office decor, so another very nice reference there, I thought. Just a couple more around this bit as well. When Bond arrives in Iceland, there's a white cat with a diamond collar in attendance at Graves' Ice Palace, and for a second I wondered if Benson was going to pull a complete number on me and actually take the plot in a totally different direction, and Blofeld was going to turn up at the party. Spectre were going to be a part of this. And also, this one I'm not sure, I might just be seeing references where references don't exist, but a Dr. Wiseman is mentioned in chapter 12, page 138, and I took that to be a deliberate reference to Joseph Wiseman, who played Dr. No in the first Bond film. And maybe I'm reading way too much into this. Maybe sometimes a Dr. Wiseman is just a Dr. Wiseman. But I'm seeing references everywhere, I can't help it. The plot plays out much like in the film again, but then we have the scene where Bond has done some investigating, he's about to be rumbled when Miranda appears, and they make out to get the guards off Bond's tail. In the film, this scene was reshot after the original version had Bond and Miranda in a hot spring, and that original version of the scene is present here in the novelization. Again, this is another deleted scene from the film that has never been released in its entirety, but we do have some stills to kind of imagine what it might have been like, and it's so fun to have this insight into how scenes like this might well have played out had they decided not to reshoot it. There are some other slight differences from what we see in the film in this whole section too. I really loved the moment in the novelization when this is after Zhao and Graves meet and we start to realize that Grave is actually a gene-therapied moon. In the film, it's all rather calm, but Benson includes a moment here where Graves has to let off some steam and he smashes a mirror, which I really liked as a violent little button to that particular scene. You get a bit more of a sense in the novelization of the whole dream machine therapy thing having an effect on Graves' psyche, which I thought was really cool, and something that isn't really touched on all that much in the film. Jinx is kidnapped, and the laser sequence takes place with the laser doing the proper Goldfinger thing and going up between her legs rather than towards her neck. But interestingly, another difference here, Bond is the one to push the button to kill Mr. Kill rather than Jinx, like in the film, and I liked the little quips that they both had here once they take care of him. The laser drilled into the back of Kill's skull. His eyes widened and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Smoke drifted out of his mouth and he fell to the floor with a massive thud. Bond hit the remote again and shut off the laser. "You killed Kill," Jinx said. "A real hothead," Bond quipped. So all the action really kicks off here. Bond confronts Graves, Miranda is revealed to be a traitor, Bond escapes, and then we come to the infamous Tsunami kite surfing sequence, and god damn it if Raymond Benson doesn't actually make this whole bit sound incredibly tense and exciting. Rising up over the brow of the wave and skimming over the rushing water was a tiny figure borne aloft by the remains of the ice jet's brake parachute. Bond had managed to fashion a kite board out of its hatch cover, and by sheer determination he was able to ride above the maelstrom. He concentrated hard on holding onto his improvised craft, for the forces of wind and wave were intent on knocking him into oblivion. Caught on the growing wave with icebergs looming up towards him on all sides, Bond steered through the nightmarish obstacle course with great skill, half surfing, half flying over the accelerating water. If the stakes hadn't been so high, it would have been the most exhilarating ride of a lifetime. Bond eventually approached an obstacle that was impossible to steer around. Up ahead was the sheer cliff of ice that formed the other end of the lake, and the huge wave was propelling him towards it at a tremendous speed. Desperate, he wrenched the ropes attached to the parachute and the board lifted out of the water. The makeshift kiteboard sailed into the air, leading the massive rush of water. The board dropped from his feet, but he clung to the chute and let it carry him over the cliff. He landed neatly on terra firma, just clearing the shower of water that broke over the bank. He dropped, rolled, and lay on the ice for a full 3 minutes before attempting to sit up. He felt his heart beating rapidly, nearly pounding a hole in his chest. His lungs gasped for breath and convulsed with pain as he sucked in the cold air. After what seemed like an eternity, Bond rose, removed the chute, and gazed towards the huge glacier at the other end of the lake and the fresh scar now on its face. Nothing else mattered. Nothing was more important. One single thought turned over and over in his mind. He was alive. I really like how Raymond Benson focuses on the immense physical strain that such an act would take on a man's body, and that Bond has a few moments to actually compose himself before he's ready to roll again. Basically, the moment isn't glossed over, and it's highlighted as this is insane and intense, and Bond is very much aware of that. It's not sort of brushed off casually, and I think that that's a really great approach to take. Lots of exciting action follows, and then of course Graves and his motley crew make their way onto the Antonov, while Bond and Jinx have to regroup with their superiors. So we come to chapter 18, which is probably the most significant chapter for additional information in the book. Graves is on the Dream Machine, and we're experiencing his memories of how he survived, how he met Miranda, how he gained her loyalty. And I thought this worked really nicely mostly as a parallel to earlier on in the book, as I mentioned earlier, where Bond is retreating into his own memories as a coping mechanism for the torture that he was enduring. The fact that Graves is sort of doing a similar thing here as part of this, like, dream machine therapy. I thought it was an interesting parallel. Both hero and villain are retreating back into their psyches as a way of coping with some kind of a form of a torture. So the chapter is filling in, you know, parts of the story that they just wouldn't possibly have time to go into in the film, which is what you kind of expect and hope that novelization does. But now I'm also thinking about some of these things in ways that I never have done before, and the logistics of the whole thing just end up playing on my mind more than they ever did previously. It is stuff like, yeah, I never really considered how short a time it is for Colonel Moon / Gustav Graves to do all of the things that he does in the time that Bond is incarcerated. And the whole thing just seems even more implausible when the details are explained. And, you know, Benson does call this out on page 207. He had accomplished the impossible, is made in reference to Graves / Moon having achieved everything that they've achieved. But yeah, I mean, 14 months to genetically change your race and then dupe your way into a fortune, build a satellite, laser, infiltrate MI6. The devil works fast, but Gustav Graves works faster. With The World Is Not Enough, I felt that a lot of the expanded stuff on Renard and Electra was really fantastic and added a lot of really nice detail and texture to those characters and their motivations. With Die Another Day, I feel like that's less so. Miranda's story about killing her own father's pretty nuts, though, and it's interesting to sort of have some details on how she became involved in the whole thing, the strings that she's pulling, and the details that are actually her. I mean, she's the one in the novelization to suggest the whole gene therapy clinic thing to Colonel Moon. But the whole stuff about, like, the diamond mine and the extra details regarding the villain's scheme, it left me sort of either asking more questions, or I was sort of, like, thinking, like, oh yeah, this is all actually, like, super implausible, isn't it? It sort of had a bit of a opposite effect, I think. And Lord knows, I sympathize with anyone who is tasked with sort of expanding on this whole scheme of, like, how Graves / Moon was able to achieve all that he did in slightly over a year. But it is nevertheless some of the most significant added material to the book, along with Bond's, you know, little adventure in South Korea earlier on in the story. Anyway, climax time. A couple of more major differences from the film here. Bond actually meets with General Moon, Graves' father, on the plane before the General goes on to have his confrontation with his son, and I really liked this moment. General Moon, much like in the film, is portrayed as a sympathetic North Korean figure to a certain extent, despite him being responsible for incarcerating Bond at the start of the story, and I felt like the pair meeting in this moment allowed for some closure on that, which was really nice. So there's the showdown with the villains, Bond versus Graves and Jinx versus Frost, and the day is saved. Graves is out the window, Frost is stabbed, but the plane is going down, so Bond and Jinx have to find a means of escape, and in the middle of all of this, Miranda Frost has a slasher movie-style one last jump scare moment, which I absolutely loved. They ran for the stairs to the hold, but the flames leapt up at them, blocking the way. They looked towards the door at the rear of the gym, but it was on fire as well. Bond eyed the objects in the room and ripped a ceremonial rug from the wall. He threw it over the stairs, temporarily blocking the flames. "Go," he shouted. Jinx headed down, but as Bond began to follow, a bloody face loomed out at him. "James," Miranda said, "take me with you." She looked as if she were at death's door, clutching the wound in her chest. Bond shook his head. "This is the life you've chosen." Miranda expected no mercy, but she obviously wanted to delay Bond long enough to thwart his escape. Flames began to eat through the rug on the stairs. "Don't you want to know why I did it?" she asked. Bond considered the question, but realized that he felt no curiosity whatsoever. "No," he replied.
This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
It was such a fun little surprise. When I read her name, I was kind of like, am I reading a typo? Or have I accidentally, like, skipped back some pages or something? But I thought it was just such a really fun, gory little detail, and Bond's coldness in leaving her there to die was awesome. Really loved that bit. And then, yeah, things wrap up in a very similar fashion to what we see in the film, and there we go. The end of the very last James Bond novelization to date. As ever with Raymond Benson's work, I found this to be a great read, and I zipped through it rather quickly, really, in just a few sittings. All of the action is really exciting, it's pacey, and it's fun to experience little differences from the film that kind of go beyond just what I've covered in this video, where I've talked about some of the bigger things, but there are so many just like, you know, line differences here and there, and of course there were a good few really fun references throughout this whole thing, and again, just getting California Girls in there was such a thing of beauty. Out of the 3 Raymond Benson penned novelizations, I feel like I got the least out of it, though, in terms of additional scenes, character details, and what have you, whereas, like I say, the Wayland tangents and the extra Renard Electra particulars from the other 2 I really loved and really made those pop for me. Maybe it's just because, like, I just like those films and those characters more, so it registered more with me than anything that could possibly be added to Dine of the Day. But, as I say, I still had a great time reading this, and we are not done with Raymond Benson just yet, because we will be talking about some of his James Bond short stories in a future video. But in the meantime, do let me know your own thoughts on the Dine of the Day novelization in the comments section below. Anyone out there read this in 2002 when it was first released? Anyone read it prior to having seen the film? Do let me know in the comments below. Also below, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay up to date on future video uploads. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.